Captain Lee Daeho gripped the shuttle controls as warning lights flashed red around him. The small diplomatic vessel shook violently as it plunged toward the alien planet below. Just minutes ago, everything had been going according to plan. He was supposed to meet the Thylorian leaders and discuss peace between their species and humanity. Earth's government had chosen him carefully for this mission because of his calm nature and skill with languages. But something had gone terribly wrong. The moment his shuttle entered Thylorian space, dozens of fighter ships appeared from nowhere. They opened fire without warning, without even trying to communicate. Daeho had barely managed to send a distress signal to Earth before his engines were hit. Now he was crash-landing on an alien world, not knowing if he would live to see another. The shuttle hit the ground hard, throwing him against his seat. Smoke filled the cabin as sparks flew from damaged equipment. Through the cracked window, he could see strange purple grass swaying in the alien wind. The sky was orange and two small moons hung low on the horizon. Everything felt wrong and dangerous. Heavy footsteps approached the wreckage. Daeho tried to reach for his emergency kit, but the shuttle door was already being torn apart. Metal screamed as powerful hands ripped it open like paper. Then he saw them. The Thylorian soldiers were unlike anything he had studied in the mission. Briefings. They stood 8 feet tall with thick blue skin that looked like armor. Each had 4 muscular arms and faces that reminded him of insects, but somehow more intelligent and threatening. Their eyes glowed with an inner light, and when they moved, it was with perfect coordination like a military unit that had trained together for years. One of them reached into the shuttle and grabbed Daeho by his uniform. The alien's grip was incredibly strong, and Daeho felt like a child being picked up by an adult. He tried to speak, to explain that he was a diplomat, but the creatures ignored his words. They bound his hands with some kind of energy rope that buzzed against his skin. The journey through their city was like walking through a dream. The buildings were made of crystal that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. Everything glowed with soft colors that shifted and changed as they walked. Strange vehicles floated past without making any sound. Other Thylorians stopped to stare at him, their alien faces showing emotions he couldn't understand. The soldiers dragged him through corridors that seemed to go on forever. The walls were smooth and warm to the touch, almost alive. Strange symbols glowed along the surfaces, probably their writing system. The air smelled of electricity and something sweet that made his nose tingle. Finally, they reached massive doors that towered above them. The doors were covered in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. When the soldiers approached, the doors split apart with a sound like breaking glass, revealing the most magnificent room Daeho had ever seen. The throne room was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Pillars of living crystal supported the space, pulsing with gentle light. But all of this faded into nothing when he saw her. Queen Nixara sat on a throne made of what looked like frozen lightning. She was 7 feet tall with skin that shifted between deep purple and silver like oil on water. Her face was beautiful in an alien way, with features that were sharp and elegant, but her eyes were what captured his attention completely. They glowed like molten gold, ancient and intelligent and terrifying. When she spoke, her voice didn't come through his ears. Instead, it appeared directly in his mind, clear and powerful and impossible to ignore. Human, you will marry me or die at sunrise. The moment Queen Nixara's words echoed in Daeho's mind, the entire throne room exploded into chaos. Dozens of Thylorian nobles began making rapid clicking sounds with their mandibles, a noise that reminded Daeho of angry insects. Some rose from their seats, their 4 arms gesturing wildly as they spoke in their alien language. Others remained, seated but swayed back and forth, which he guessed was their way of showing shock or disapproval. Daeho's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. His small translation device, built into his uniform collar, was working overtime but kept producing error messages. The concept of marriage between species was apparently so foreign that the machine couldn't find proper words for it. He could hear fragments of translations: impossible, forbidden, against nature, but nothing that helped him make sense of the situation. "Your Majesty," Daeho said, his voice cracking slightly from fear and confusion. He had trained for many diplomatic scenarios, but this was beyond anything Earth's experts had prepared him for. "I don't understand why you would want to marry someone from another species. We've only just met, and our peoples have been enemies until today." The Queen's forearms moved with fluid grace as she raised one hand. The gesture was small, but its effect was immediate and absolute. Every sound in the massive throne room stopped instantly. The chittering nobles fell silent. The guards stopped shifting their weight. Even the soft humming of the crystal pillars seemed to quiet down. The power she commanded was unlike anything Dai-Ho had ever witnessed. "Your species has something mine needs desperately," Queen Nixara said, her mental voice carrying emotions that felt heavy and urgent. "This union will save both our peoples, or your death will serve as a warning to others who might refuse to help us." Before Dai-Ho could respond, an ancient Thylorian approached the throne. This creature was clearly very old, with deep scars running across what looked like natural armor plating on his chest and arms. His movements were slower than the other Thylorians, but there was dignity in the way he carried himself. The other nobles showed him obvious respect, stepping aside as he passed. The old advisor climbed the steps to the throne and leaned close to Queen Nixara. He began speaking in rapid Thylorian, his voice too low for Dai-Ho's translator to pick up clearly. But the tone was urgent, almost pleading. The advisor kept glancing at Dai-Ho while he spoke, and his gestures suggested he was arguing against something. As the conversation continued, Queen Nixara's golden eyes began to glow brighter. What had been a steady, warm light now flickered and danced like flames. Her skin shifted colors more rapidly, the purple and silver patterns swirling across her face and arms. Even without understanding their language, Dai-Ho could tell that whatever the advisor was saying was making her angry. The other nobles watched this exchange with obvious tension. Some leaned forward in their seats, trying to hear the whispered conversation. Others looked back and forth between their queen and the human prisoner, probably wondering if they were about to witness an execution. Dai-Ho felt completely helpless. His life was being decided by creatures he didn't understand, in a language he couldn't speak, for reasons that made no sense to him. The weight of representing all of humanity suddenly felt crushing. Whatever happened here might determine whether Earth and the Thylorian Empire went to war or found peace. The Queen's response to her advisor was brief, but sharp. Even without translation, the tone was clearly a command to stop talking. The old Thylorian bowed his head and stepped back, but his scarred face showed deep concern. Queen Nixara turned her attention back to Dai-Ho, and he felt the full force of her mental presence focusing on him. It was like standing in front of a powerful searchlight that could see not just his body but somehow his thoughts and emotions as well. "Time grows short, human," she said, and now her mental voice carried something that might have been sadness mixed with determination. "Choose quickly, marriage or death. There is no third option." The guards led Dai-Ho through winding corridors that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The walls around him were smooth and warm, almost organic, as if the entire building was alive. Strange patterns of light moved beneath the surface, creating hypnotic displays that made him feel dizzy if he stared too long. He tried to focus on walking straight and not stumbling, knowing that showing weakness now could mean death. Thylorian law demands proof of worthiness, Queen Nixara had explained before they left the throne room. Her golden eyes had studied him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. 3 trials await you, mind, body, and spirit. Fail any and execution awaits at dawn. The chamber they entered was unlike anything Dai-Ho had ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a football stadium, with a domed ceiling that displayed what looked like a real-time view of space. Stars twinkled overhead, and he could see several planets rotating slowly in the distance. The floor was made of the same crystal material as everything else, but it was perfectly smooth and reflected the cosmic display above. Dozens of holographic screens floated in the air around the room, each showing different star systems, fleet, movements, and tactical information. Thylorian officers moved between the displays with practiced efficiency, their forearms allowing them to manipulate multiple screens at once. The technology was so advanced that it made Earth's best military computers look like children's toys. "The first trial tests your mind," announced a Thylorian general who approached them. This creature was different from the soldiers who had captured him. His natural armor was polished to a mirror shine, and intricate symbols were carved into his carapace. When he moved, other officers immediately stepped aside, showing the respect due to someone of high rank. "How you will command a fleet in battle against our greatest strategic minds," the general continued, gesturing toward a raised platform in the center of the room. "If you lose, you prove that humans are too weak to be worthy of our queen. If you win—" He paused, and Daeho could swear he saw amusement in the alien's compound eyes. "Well, no outsider has ever won." 3 other Thylorian generals approached the platform, each taking their position at control stations that looked like orchestra conductors' podiums. These were clearly the Empire's most experienced military leaders. Their movements were confident and precise, and they studied Daeho with the focused attention of predators sizing up prey. The simulation began instantly. Holographic fleets materialized in the space above them, thousands of ships represented by glowing dots of light. The Thylorian generals immediately began moving their forces with smooth, coordinated motions. Their strategy was obvious and overwhelming. Massive formations of battleships advancing in perfect lines, supported by clouds of smaller fighters. Daeho felt his heart racing as he looked at his own fleet. He had fewer ships, and they appeared smaller and less powerful than the Thylorian vessels. In a direct confrontation, he would be destroyed within minutes. But as he studied the enemy formations, he began to notice something interesting. The Thylorian tactics were perfect, but they were also predictable. Every movement followed classical military doctrine, just like the textbooks he had studied at Earth's Naval Academy. Instead of meeting their advance head-on, Daeho began splitting his fleet into small groups. He sent some ships to hide behind asteroids and space debris, while others retreated to the edge of the battlefield. The Thylorian generals looked confused by this apparent cowardice, and he could hear them chittering to each other in their native language. When the enemy fleets reached the center of the battlefield, Daeho sprang his trap. His hidden ships attacked from multiple directions at once, targeting the supply lines and command vessels that the Thylorians had left undefended. Meanwhile, his retreating forces suddenly turned around and struck the enemy's rear formations. The Thylorian generals tried to adapt, but their massive fleets were too slow to respond to the rapid hit-and-run attacks. Daeho used their own size against them, causing their ships to accidentally fire on each other in the confusion. Within an hour of simulated battle, the mighty Thylorian armada was scattered and defeated. Silence filled the chamber as the simulation ended. The Thylorian officers stared at the holographic display showing Daeho's unexpected victory. Some of them began checking their equipment, clearly thinking there had been a malfunction. Others looked at him with expressions he couldn't read, but which seemed to contain a new level of respect. Queen Nixara's mental voice echoed in his mind, and for the first time, it carried something that might have been approval. "Perhaps there is more to your kind than we assumed." The arena was a coliseum that could have held 50,000 spectators, carved from the same living crystal that made up the rest of the Thylorian palace. Daeho stood at one entrance, looking up at the towering walls that stretched impossibly high above him. The crowd's chittering filled the air like the sound of 1,000 angry insects, but he could feel their excitement rather than hostility. They had come to see a show, and he was about to provide it. Across the vast sandy floor of the arena stood his opponent, and Daeho felt his courage nearly fail him. Thokvar was a monster of a creature, even by Thylorian standards. He stood nearly 10 feet tall with natural armor plating that looked thick enough to stop a tank shell. His 4 massive arms ended in claws that could probably tear through steel, and when he moved, the ground seemed to shake beneath his weight. "Behold Thokvar, champion of 1,000 battles," announced the arena master, his voice echoing from speakers built into the crystal walls. "Never defeated, never even wounded in combat. Today, he faces the small human who dares to court our queen." Daeho looked up at the royal viewing box, where Queen Nixara sat on a throne made of what looked like frozen lightning. Her golden eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. He could feel her mental presence at the edge of his consciousness, not speaking but somehow watching his thoughts. A weapon rack rose from the arena floor, offering him various alien implements of war. There were energy swords that hummed with power, projectile weapons that looked like they could punch holes through concrete, and armor that gleamed with protective fields. But Daiho studied them for only a moment before shaking his head. None of these weapons would be effective against Thokvar's natural defenses, and the armor would only slow him down. Instead, he began examining the arena itself. The walls were smooth crystal, but there were structural supports running along them at regular intervals. Strange devices were mounted near the ceiling, probably the anti-gravity generators that allowed for more spectacular combat by letting fighters leap impossible distances or walk on walls. Thokvar began his charge with a roar that shook dust. From the ceiling, his massive feet pounded the arena floor as he closed the distance between them with frightening speed. Daiho waited until the last possible second, then dove to one side, rolling across the sand and coming up near one of the structural supports. The crowd chittered with what sounded like disappointment. They had expected a heroic last stand, not cowardly running. But Daiho ignored their reactions and focused on his plan. He began climbing the crystal support beam, using small handholds that were probably meant for maintenance workers. Thokvar followed him up the wall with surprising agility for such a large creature. His claws found easy purchase in the crystal surface, and he climbed faster than Daiho could manage. Just as those massive hands reached for his legs, Daiho activated one of the anti-gravity fields. Suddenly, up became down, and sideways became forward. Thokvar, who had been climbing upward, found himself falling toward what had been the wall. He crashed into the crystal surface with tremendous force, sending cracks spiderwebbing through the material. But the champion was far from finished. He roared his anger and began climbing again, this time more carefully. Daiho knew he couldn't use the same trick twice. Instead, he began moving along the support beams near the ceiling, using the anti-gravity fields to leap from one to another, like a three-dimensional maze. Each time Thokvar got close, Daiho would shift gravity fields or swing to another beam. The champion's powerful attacks began striking the support structures instead of his target. Crystal beams cracked and groaned under the assault, and Daiho realized he might have found his solution. He positioned himself directly under a massive section of decorative ceiling that was supported by the beam Thokvar was attacking. The champion raised all four arms for a devastating blow that would have torn Daiho in half. Instead, it shattered the support beam completely. Tons of crystal ceiling came crashing down. Daiho used the anti-gravity field to launch himself clear, but Thokvar was caught directly underneath the avalanche. The massive warrior disappeared under a pile of rubble that would have crushed any normal creature to paste. For a moment, the arena was completely silent. Then the rubble began to shift and Thokvar's head emerged, battered but very much alive. He was pinned from the chest down, but his eyes were clear and alert. Most surprisingly of all, he was making a rapid clicking sound with his mandibles. "Clever little human," Thokvar said, his voice carrying genuine amusement. "You fight like Thylorian younglings, with cunning rather than strength. I have not been surprised in battle for 50 years. Today, you have given me a gift." The crowd's chittering had changed from disappointment to something that sounded almost like approval. They had expected to see their champion crush a weakling, but instead they had witnessed something entirely different. A small creature using intelligence and creativity to defeat overwhelming force. From her throne, Queen Nixara's golden eyes seemed to glow brighter than before, and Daiho felt her mental voice brush against his thoughts with what might have been admiration. The final trial took place in a chamber, unlike any other in the palace. It was perfectly round and completely empty, except for two chairs facing each other in the center. The walls were made of smooth black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and terrifying. Strange symbols glowed faintly along the ceiling, pulsing with a rhythm that matched Daiho's heartbeat. Queen Nixara entered the chamber alone, without her usual guards or advisors. She moved with a grace that seemed almost ghostly, her skin shifting between purple and silver, in patterns that reminded Daiho of ripples on water. Her golden eyes were dimmer than usual, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked Tired. The third trial tests your spirit, she said, settling into one of the chairs. Her mental voice was softer now, almost gentle. We must join our minds completely. You will see everything I am, and I will see everything you are. No secrets, no barriers, no protection from the truth. Deho sat in the chair across from her, trying to control his fear. What happens if a human mind can't handle the connection? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then you will die, she replied simply. Your brain will burn out like an overloaded circuit. It has happened before with other species who attempted this ritual, but if you survive, you will understand why I have made this desperate choice. She reached out with all four of her hands, and Deho took them in his own. Her skin felt warm and slightly electric, like touching a battery that was just beginning to charge. The moment their flesh made contact, the world around him began to dissolve. At first there was only pain. It felt like someone was pouring molten metal directly into his skull, while simultaneously pulling his brain apart with hot wires. Every nerve in his body screamed in agony, and he wanted to let go of her hands and run from the chamber. But somehow he held on. Then the pain transformed into something else entirely. Suddenly, he wasn't Deho anymore. He was Queen Nyxara, experiencing her memories as if they were his own. He felt the weight of ruling an empire that stretched across dozens of star systems, the loneliness of making decisions that affected billions of lives, and the crushing responsibility of keeping his people safe. But underneath all of that was something far worse, a terror so deep and overwhelming that it made his earlier fear seem like nothing. Through Nyxara's memories, he witnessed scenes of horror that would haunt him forever. He saw Thylorian colonies that had once been thriving cities, now filled with nothing but statues. The plague that was consuming their species didn't kill quickly or mercifully. Instead, it slowly turned living beings into crystal sculptures, trapping their consciousness inside, while their bodies hardened into beautiful, lifeless art. The transformation took weeks, and the victims remained aware throughout the entire process. They could see and hear and think, but they couldn't move or speak or cry out for help. Families were forced to watch as their loved ones became living statues, still conscious, but unable to interact with the world around them. Entire planets had fallen to this curse. Billions of Thylorians were now trapped in crystal prisons, aware but helpless, waiting for death that might never come. The Empire's greatest scientists had tried everything, medicine, technology, even ancient magic, but nothing worked. The plague continued to spread, and every day brought reports of new colonies falling silent. Through Nyxara's memories, Deho felt the Queen's desperation as she searched for any possible solution. She had sent expeditions to distant galaxies, consulted with alien species that were barely more than legends, and even tried negotiating with cosmic entities that existed outside normal space and time. Nothing had worked. Then her scientists made a discovery. Somehow human genetic material contained properties that seemed to resist the crystallization process. It wasn't a cure, but it might be the foundation for developing one. The problem was that humans and Thylorians were too different biologically. The only way to combine their genetics effectively would be through offspring, children who carried traits from both species. The mental connection deepened, and Deho felt Nyxara's emotions as if they were his own. The overwhelming grief of watching her people suffer, the crushing weight of responsibility for finding a solution, the desperate hope that this insane plan might actually work, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion from carrying this burden alone for so long. You. See now, her mental voice whispered, filled with exhaustion and grief that seemed to have no bottom. I am not a conqueror seeking a trophy. I am not a tyrant collecting exotic pets. I am a mother watching her children die, grasping at the only hope that remains. Through their shared consciousness, he felt her pain as if it were his own. The sleepless nights spent reviewing medical reports, the agony of making public appearances, while hiding the truth about how desperate their situation had become. The terrible loneliness of making decisions that could save or doom both their species. When the connection finally broke, Deho found himself back in his own body, gasping for air like he had been drowning. Tears were streaming down his face. Tears for suffering he had witnessed, for people he had never met but now felt connected to forever. Queen Nixara sat across from him, her golden eyes wet with tears of her own. For the first time since he had met her, she looked vulnerable and human despite her alien appearance. "Now you know," she said softly. "Will you help me save them?" Deho sat in the empty chamber for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't tell if it was from the after effects of the mental connection or from the overwhelming weight of what he had learned. The images from Queen Nixara's memories played over and over in his mind. Entire cities of crystal statues, children trapped in their own bodies, families torn apart by a plague that no one understood. He looked up at the Queen, who had moved, to stand near one of the glowing symbols on the wall. Without her royal robes and surrounded by guards, she looked smaller somehow, more fragile. The confident ruler who had terrified him in the throne room was gone, replaced by someone who carried the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting an impossible battle for too long. "The choice is yours, human," she said, turning to face him. Her golden eyes held no threats now, only a desperate hope that she was trying hard to hide. "Save my people through this union, or let both our species face what comes next in isolation." "Both. How species?" Deho asked, though something in his heart already knew what she was going to say. Queen Nixara's expression grew even more grave. "The plague isn't just affecting Thylorians anymore. 3 weeks ago we received distress signals from human colonies on the outer rim of your space. The same symptoms, people slowly turning to crystal, remaining conscious throughout the transformation. Your government hasn't told your people yet, but they've been secretly contacting us for help." The words hit Deho like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind of his sister's family, living on one of those outer colonies, of his childhood friends who had joined the colonial expansion program, of thousands of innocent people who had no idea what was coming for them. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "Our scientists believe the plague spreads along trade routes and communication networks. Given current patterns, it will reach Earth's core systems within 2 years, maybe less." She paused, studying his face. "My researchers believe that a hybrid offspring, children who carry genetic material from both our species, might possess natural immunity. It's not guaranteed, but it's the only real hope either of us has." Deho stood up and began pacing around the small chamber. The weight of the decision felt crushing. He thought about his life back on Earth, his job as a diplomat, his small apartment overlooking the Pacific Ocean, his plans to maybe settle down and start a family someday. All of that would be gone if he accepted this proposal. But then he thought about the alternative. If he refused, both humans and Thylorians would face extinction. The plague would continue spreading until every intelligent being in their part of the galaxy was trapped in a crystal prison, aware but helpless, waiting for a death that might never come. "Why me?" he asked suddenly. "There must be other humans you could have chosen, people with better genetics or more important positions, or—" "You survived the mental link," Queen Nixara interrupted. "Most beings die when they attempt to merge consciousness with a Thylorian royal. The fact that you lived through it suggests your mind has unusual flexibility and strength. These are exactly the traits we need to pass on to the next generation." She moved closer to him, and he could see the desperation she had been hiding behind her royal composure. "I know what I'm asking of you. I'm asking you to give up your old life, to become something new and unknown, to take responsibility for the survival of billions of people you've never met. It's not fair, and I have no right to demand such a sacrifice." "But you're asking anyway," Deho said, not accusingly but with understanding. "Because I have to," she replied simply. "Because if I don't ask, and you don't accept, then everyone dies. My people, your people, possibly every thinking creature in this galaxy. The plague shows no signs of stopping on its own." Deho walked to the chamber's single window, which looked out over the crystal city below. Thousands of Thylorians moved through the streets, going about their daily lives, unaware that their queen was negotiating for their very survival. They looked so different from humans, with their 4 arms and insect-like features. But after sharing Nixara's consciousness, He could see past the alien exterior to the people underneath. They had families they loved, dreams they cherished, fears that kept them awake at night, just like humans. The realization hit him that this wasn't really about him at all. This was about the future of intelligent life itself. Two species facing extinction, with only one desperate chance for survival. His personal wants and fears seemed incredibly small compared to the stakes involved. He turned back to Queen Nixara, who was watching him with barely concealed anxiety. For all her power and authority, in this moment she was just another person hoping that someone would choose to help when everything was on the line. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "what happens to us? To who we are as individuals?" Her expression softened slightly. "I don't know," she admitted. "We would be creating something entirely new, a partnership between species that has never existed before. We might find that we genuinely care for each other, or we might simply be allies working toward a common goal, but either way, we would be giving our peoples a chance to survive." Daiho closed his eyes and thought about everything he had learned. The weight of two civilizations rested on his shoulders, and the choice he made in the next few minutes would echo through history forever. The silence that followed Daiho's declaration was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. He stood in the center of the crystal chamber, facing Queen Nixara with a determination that surprised even himself. The fear was still there. He wasn't stupid enough to think he could physically challenge a being who could crush him without effort, but something had changed inside him during their mental connection. "I accept," he repeated, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But not as your subordinate, not as some trophy husband to be paraded around while you make all the decisions. If we do this, we do it as equals. Our peoples must learn to work together, not as conqueror and conquered." The shock on Queen Nixara's face was unmistakable. Her forearms moved in small, unconscious gestures that he was beginning to recognize as signs of surprise among her people. The golden glow in her eyes flickered like candlelight in a sudden breeze, and her skin shifted through rapid color changes that probably reflected her emotional state. For several long moments, she simply stared at him. Then, slowly, her mental voice began to carry something that sounded almost like laughter. "You would demand equality from one who could crush you with a thought." The amusement in her tone was clear, but underneath it was something that might have been respect. "Perhaps that is exactly what both our peoples need. Someone foolish enough to stand up to power." Before either of them could say more, the chamber doors burst open with a sound like breaking glass. Thylorian nobles rushed in, followed closely by what looked like a group of humans in diplomatic uniforms. Daiho recognized some of them from Earth's Foreign Service, though he had no idea how they had gotten here so quickly. "Your Majesty," one of the Thylorian advisors said, his forearms gesturing frantically, "we cannot allow this precedent. If you grant equality to one alien, what prevents others from making the same demands? The Empire has existed for 1,000 years under the principle of Thylorian supremacy." At the same time, a human diplomat approached Daiho with obvious urgency. "Captain Lee, we've been monitoring the situation from Earth. You can't seriously be considering this arrangement. The political implications alone would destabilize human-alien relations for decades." What followed was unlike any negotiation Daiho had ever witnessed. The crystal chamber filled with representatives from both species, all talking at once in a mixture of languages that his translator could barely keep up with. Thylorian nobles argued about ancient laws and traditions, while human diplomats debated the constitutional implications of one of their citizens marrying an alien queen. Queen Nixara took control of the situation with the authority that came from ruling an interstellar empire. She raised all four of her hands, and immediately every voice in the room fell silent. "We will negotiate properly," she announced, her mental voice reaching everyone present regardless of species. "Both our peoples face extinction. We will find a solution that serves everyone, or we will all die together in the coming plague." Tables and chairs materialized from the crystal floor. Apparently, the Thylorian palace could reshape itself as needed. Representatives from both species took their positions, and what began as a marriage proposal quickly evolved into something far, more complex, the foundation of an entirely new form of government. The humans wanted guarantees that their people would maintain their independence and cultural identity. They insisted on joint leadership structures, shared technology, and equal representation in any decisions that affected both species. The Thylorians, meanwhile, worried about losing their traditional power structures and allowing outsiders too much influence in their empire. Daeho found himself at the center of discussions that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He wasn't just agreeing to marry an alien queen, he was helping to design a hybrid civilization that would combine the best aspects of both their peoples. The marriage would be symbolic as much as practical, representing a new form of partnership between species. The children, Queen Nyxara said during one particularly intense debate, must be raised understanding both cultures equally. They cannot favor one parent's heritage over the other if they are to truly represent both peoples. Agreed, Daeho replied, but that means both of us have to change. I'll need to learn Thylorian customs and ways of thinking, and you'll need to understand human values like individual freedom and democratic decision-making. The negotiations continued for hours, with breaks only when the translator's equipment overheated from processing so many different languages and concepts. Maps were drawn and redrawn, showing how territories would be administered jointly. LDWS were debated that would govern interactions between species. Trade agreements were outlined that would benefit both civilizations. But through it all, the most important question remained unspoken. Would this desperate alliance actually work? Could two species that had been enemies just days ago really learn to function as partners? And even if they could, would it be enough to stop the plague that threatened to destroy them both? As the negotiations stretched into the night, Daeho realized that he was no longer just Captain Lee from Earth's diplomatic corps. He was becoming something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, a symbol of hope for billions of people, and quite possibly the last chance for intelligent life in their galaxy. The weight of that responsibility should have been terrifying. But instead, he felt oddly calm. Whatever happened next, at least they were trying. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. The wedding day arrived faster than Daeho had expected, bringing with it a mixture of excitement and terror that made his stomach feel like it was filled with butterflies trying to escape. He stood in his preparation chamber, looking at himself in a mirror made of polished crystal that somehow showed his reflection more clearly than any glass he had ever seen on Earth. The ceremony outfit was unlike anything he had ever worn. It combined elements from both cultures, a formal human suit made from Earth's finest materials, but decorated with Thylorian symbols that glowed softly with their own inner light. The fabric felt strange against his skin, almost alive, and he wondered if this was just the beginning of how different his life was about to become. "Are you ready for this?" he asked his reflection, though he already knew the answer. Ready or not, billions of lives depended on what happened today. Queen Nyxara had chosen to use a human name for the ceremony, Nina, to help both their peoples feel more comfortable with the union. It was a small gesture, but Daeho appreciated the effort she was making to bridge their two worlds. She had been making many such compromises, learning human customs just as he had been studying Thylorian traditions. The great cathedral where the ceremony would take place was a marvel of engineering that combined architecture from both species. Soaring crystal spires reached toward the sky in classic Thylorian style, but the interior had been modified with human touches, wooden benches, stained glass windows showing scenes from Earth's history, and flowers from dozens of different planets that filled the air with familiar scents. Thousands of guests filled the cathedral, with millions more watching through holographic broadcasts that reached every corner of both empires. The reactions were as mixed as expected. Some saw the wedding as a beautiful symbol of unity between species, while others viewed it as a betrayal of everything their civilizations stood for. Protests were happening on dozens of worlds. On Earth, crowds gathered outside government buildings, some chanting support for Daeho's courage, while others called him a traitor to humanity. Similar demonstrations were taking place across Thylorian space, with traditional nobles arguing that their queen was weakening the empire by sharing power with an inferior species. But inside the cathedral, as the ceremony began, all of that noise seemed to fade away. Daiho walked down the aisle to the sound of music that blended human orchestral instruments with Thylorian crystal harps, creating melodies that neither species had heard before but somehow felt familiar to both. Nina appeared at the other end of the cathedral, and Daiho felt his breath catch in his throat. She had modified her appearance for the ceremony, softening some of her more alien features, while keeping enough of her natural form to remain recognizably Thylorian. Her skin had settled into a warm golden color that complemented her glowing eyes, and she moved with a grace that seemed to make the very air around her shimmer. The vows they exchanged were written together, combining promises from both cultures. They spoke of partnership rather than ownership, of building something new rather than conquering what already existed, of facing whatever challenges came with unity rather than division. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Daiho said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustic systems. "To learn from your wisdom while sharing my own, to stand beside you as an equal, and to help our peoples build a future that honors both of our heritage." Nina's response came through both her voice and her mental connection, reaching everyone in the cathedral simultaneously. "I promise to respect your independence while sharing my strength, to lead alongside you rather than above you, and to create with you something greater than either of our species could achieve alone." But the real ceremony, the part that would truly bind them together, came after the public vows. In a private chamber deep within the palace, they underwent the biological transformation that would make their union more than just symbolic. The Thylorian biotechnology was beyond anything human science had achieved. Microscopic machines entered Daiho's bloodstream, beginning the process of altering his genetic structure at the cellular level. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, not sharp like an injury, but deep and constant, as if his entire body was being slowly taken apart and rebuilt from the inside out. He could feel his immune system changing, becoming stronger and more adaptable. His brain was developing new neural pathways that would allow him to communicate telepathically with Thylorians. His cellular structure was being reinforced to resist the crystallization plague that threatened both their species. The worst part was that he remained conscious throughout the entire process. He could feel every change as it happened, every modification to his basic biology. There were moments when he wasn't sure if he was still human, still himself, or if he was becoming something entirely different. Nina underwent her own transformation, at the same time gaining human adaptability and resilience while keeping her Thylorian strengths. Through their developing mental link, he could feel her pain mixing with his own, but also her determination to see this through. When the process finally ended, they looked at each other with eyes that could now see things that had been invisible before. Daiho still appeared human to outside observers, but he could feel the changes within himself. Enhanced strength, improved healing, and most remarkably, the ability to sense Nina's thoughts and emotions directly. They were no longer just two individuals who had agreed to work together. They had become something new, partners connected at a level that neither species had ever experienced before. Whether this would be enough to save their peoples remained to be seen, but for the first time since this impossible situation began, Daiho felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The medical reports were spread across Daiho's desk like pages from a miracle. 6 months ago, these same documents had been filled with nothing but bad news. Colony after colony falling to the crystallization plague, death counts rising into the billions, and projections that showed both species facing extinction within a decade. Today, for the first time since the crisis began, the numbers were moving in the right direction. He picked up a report from the Thylorian colony of Velthar, a world that had been completely written off just 4 months earlier. The entire population had been turned to crystal statues, their consciousness trapped in beautiful but lifeless forms. According to the latest update, 60% of the colonists had been successfully restored to their normal forms, with more recovering every day. "The treatment is working faster than we hoped," Nina said. entering their shared office aboard the flagship that served as headquarters for their joint operation. She moved with the fluid grace that had initially seemed so alien to him, but now felt as familiar as his own heartbeat. Her skin had settled into a warm golden tone that seemed to glow softly in the ship's lighting. Through their mental connection, he could feel her excitement and relief, the weight she had carried for so long, the crushing responsibility of watching her people die while being powerless to help them, was finally beginning to lift. It was like watching someone who had been holding their breath for years, finally being able to breathe again. "The human colonies are showing even better results," Daeho replied, sharing his own sense of amazement through their link. "The outer rim settlements that were hit first are reporting complete immunity to new infections. Whatever we created together, it's stronger than either of our species could have developed alone." The science behind their success was still being studied by researchers from both civilizations, but the basic principle was clear enough. The genetic combination that resulted from their union had created something entirely new, a hybrid immunity that could resist the crystallization plague, while also enhancing the natural strengths of both species. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the desperate political arrangement it had started as. What began as two strangers agreeing to sacrifice their personal lives for the greater good had slowly grown into something genuine and deep. They had learned to work together, to think together, and eventually to care for each other in ways that surprised them both. It hadn't been easy. There were still protesters on both sides who saw their union as an abomination or a betrayal. Some humans felt that Daeho had sold out his own species, while traditional Thylorians accused Nina of weakening the empire by sharing power with an outsider. But the results spoke for themselves. Both civilizations were not only surviving, but thriving in ways they never had before. The bridge of their flagship offered a perfect view of the joint fleet operations happening all around them. Human and Thylorian vessels worked side by side, their crews learning each other's languages and customs while distributing the cure to affected worlds. The sight would have been unthinkable a year ago, when the two species were on the brink of war. "Look at them," Nina said, following his gaze to where a human medical ship was docking with a Thylorian transport. 6 months ago, those crews would have been shooting at each other. Now they're saving lives together. Through the massive viewport, they could see teams of mixed species working together to load medical supplies. Human doctors were learning Thylorian healing techniques, while Thylorian scientists were adapting human medical equipment for use in different atmospheric conditions. The cooperation was still awkward sometimes, with cultural misunderstandings and communication problems, but it was working. "The children are going to grow up in a very different universe than the one we knew," Daeho observed, thinking about the reports they had been receiving about the next generation. Human and Thylorian youngsters were learning each other's languages as naturally as their own, and some were even developing limited telepathic abilities that allowed them to communicate across species barriers. Nina's mental voice carried a warmth that he had learned to associate with her deepest emotions. "Did you ever imagine that a marriage born of desperation would become the foundation of a new age?" Daeho smiled, reaching out to take her hand in his. The simple gesture would have been impossible when they first met. The biological differences between their species had been too great, but the changes they had undergone together had made such connections natural and easy. "I've learned that sometimes the most impossible choices lead to the most extraordinary futures," he replied. "When I was captured and dragged before your throne, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Through their shared consciousness, he felt Nina's agreement and something deeper, a sense of completeness that neither of them had expected to find. They had saved their peoples and created something entirely new in the process. The future was still uncertain, with countless challenges ahead, but for the first time in either of their lives, it felt full of hope and possibility. Outside the viewport, the stars shone with a light that seemed brighter than before, as if the universe itself was celebrating the dawn of a new age.